For 12 years, my in-laws referred to my father as the mechanic. Never by name, never with anything resembling respect, just a quiet, dismissive label they used whenever they thought I couldn't hear it. Then, 3 months ago, I sat beside my father in a folding chair at a National Guard armory, watching a 2-star general walk directly past 3 rows of decorated officers to reach him first. The general saluted him before he said a single word. Then he addressed my father by a rank none of us, including me, had ever once heard him use. This is that story. The man who never explained himself. Before I tell you about that armory, you need to understand my father, because he's never once been an easy man to explain to anyone. My name is Nora Kessler. I'm 31, and I grew up in a small house outside Erie, Pennsylvania, raised mostly by my father, Gerald, after my mother passed away when I was 7. He ran a small auto repair shop downtown for as long as I can remember. Kessler's Garage, a squat brick building with a hand-painted sign he never once bothered to update. My father was quiet in a way that other people sometimes mistook for simple. He didn't talk about his past. He didn't tell war stories, didn't display photographs of anything beyond my school pictures on his workshop wall, didn't so much as own a single piece of military memorabilia that I ever saw growing up. When I asked him, as a kid, if he'd ever served, he'd say only, "A long time ago, for a little while," and change the subject before I could ask anything else. I learned early not to push. My father had a way of going quiet, entirely still, whenever certain subjects came too close, and something in me, even as a child, understood that stillness deserved respect rather than curiosity. He raised me on grease-stained hands and steady routines, dinner at 6, homework at the kitchen table, church on Sundays he never once missed. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't impressive in any way that showed up easily on the surface. He was simply, entirely present, every single day of my life, in a way I wouldn't fully understand the value of until much later. Meeting the Sterlings. I met my husband, Adam Sterling, in my mid-20s, at a mutual friend's dinner party I almost skipped. He was warm and funny in a way that caught me off guard, and within a year I found myself sitting at his family's dining table for the first time, nervous in a way I hadn't expected to be. The Sterling family had money, old money, the kind that came with a lake house and a family name people in their social circle recognized. Adam's mother, Vivian, ran a small but influential architecture firm, and his father, Charles, sat on the board of 2 regional banks. They were polite to me in the careful, appraising way wealthy families are sometimes polite to people they haven't yet decided are worth the effort. Vivian asked, within the first 10 minutes of meeting me, what my parents did. I told her, honestly and with the same simple pride I'd always felt, that my father ran a small auto repair shop and that my mother had passed away when I was young. Vivian's smile in response was polished and brief. "How practical," she said, in a tone that made the words sound faintly like an apology she was extending on my behalf. "A hands-on trade. There's something to be said for that." I laughed it off that night in the car. Adam apologized, the way he'd apologized many more times over the years that followed for comments his mother made without ever quite meaning to take back. 12 years of the mechanic. Over the 12 years that followed, dating, engagement, marriage, 2 children, my father became, in Sterling family conversations, simply the mechanic. Never Gerald, never Nora's father, just a quiet, functional label delivered without any apparent malice, which somehow made it worse. "The mechanic's coming to Christmas again this year?" Vivian would ask, every December, as though my father's presence at his own grandchildren's holiday required some small note of clarification. At my wedding, during the toasts, Charles Sterling made a joke about how the Sterling and Kessler families represented different corners of the workforce, a line that got a polite, uncomfortable laugh from half the room and made my father's jaw tighten in a way I'd rarely seen. My father never once responded to any of it directly. He'd simply nod, help clear dishes without being asked, fix whatever minor mechanical problem existed on the Sterling property during every visit. A sticking garage door, a rattling dishwasher, a lawnmower that wouldn't start. Quietly, without comment, the way he seemed to fix everything in his life. I asked him once, driving home from a particularly difficult Thanksgiving, whether it bothered him, the way Adam's family talked about him. He was quiet for a long moment, hands steady on the wheel, before he said, I've been called worse things by better people, Nora. Let them talk. I didn't understand then exactly what that sentence meant. I would, eventually. The old jacket. There was one object in my father's life that had always quietly puzzled me. An old olive drab field jacket, worn thin at the elbows, that he kept in the back of his closet and occasionally wore on cold mornings at the garage, always with the same faded unit patch on the shoulder that he never once explained. I asked him about it once in my 20s, home for a visit. He said only that it was from a long time ago, the same careful deflection he'd used my entire childhood, and changed the subject to ask about my job. I noticed, over the years, that he treated that jacket with a specific, quiet care he didn't extend to almost anything else he owned, hanging it properly instead of tossing it over a chair, never once letting it go through the wash with anything else. I mentioned it to Adam once, early in our marriage, half as a joke about my father's one genuine eccentricity. Adam mentioned it, in turn, to his mother at a family dinner, framing it lightly, curiously. Perhaps it was army surplus, Vivian said, barely looking up from her plate. Practical men often hold on to practical things. The conversation moved on. I remember feeling in that small moment a flash of something protective and unexplained on my father's behalf, though I couldn't have told you why. The invitation. The invitation arrived at my father's house on a Tuesday in early spring. A formal envelope from the Pennsylvania National Guard, addressed directly to Gerald Kessler, requesting his presence at a regional armory for what the letter described only as a formal recognition ceremony honoring distinguished former service members. My father called me that evening, his voice unusually careful. Nora, I need you to come with me to something. I'll explain when you get here. I drove out that weekend, finding him at his kitchen table with the invitation open in front of him, an expression on his face I'd never once seen, something between resignation and old, carefully buried grief. They found me, he said quietly, before I'd even sat down. After all this time, someone from my old unit, doing some kind of historical documentation project, apparently. They've been trying to track down surviving members for a formal recognition. He paused. I was hoping this particular part of my life would simply stay where I'd put it. I asked him, as gently as I could, what exactly he meant. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me, in careful, measured pieces, about a deployment decades earlier, about actions during a single, catastrophic night he'd never once discussed with anyone, including, apparently, my late mother. He told me about a rescue under fire that had, according to the letter in front of him, resulted in a Silver Star recommendation he'd never once followed up on, choosing instead to come home quietly and build a life that asked nothing more of him than steady, ordinary work. I didn't want to be defined by one night, he said. I wanted to just be your father, a mechanic. That felt like enough. Telling Adam's family. I told Adam that night, sitting on our back porch, the whole quiet weight of what my father had shared settling slowly over both of us. Adam was stunned in a way I understood completely. 12 years of Sunday dinners with a man his family had casually dismissed as simply practical, never once suspecting what he'd actually carried, silently, his entire adult life. We decided, together, to invite the Sterling family to the ceremony, partly out of genuine family inclusion, and partly, I'll admit honestly, because some part of me wanted them to finally understand exactly who they'd spent over a decade quietly diminishing. Vivian's response, when Adam called to extend the invitation, was politely confused. A military ceremony? For your father-in-law? I didn't realize he'd served in any significant capacity. He hasn't talked about it, Adam said carefully. Apparently there's more to it than any of us knew. She agreed to attend, mostly, I suspect, out of simple social curiosity, rather than any genuine anticipation of what the day might actually reveal. The morning of. The ceremony was held on a bright Saturday morning at the Regional National Guard Armory, a large, formal hall filled with folding chairs, an honor guard positioned near the stage, and a small crowd of families gathered to watch a handful of aging veterans receive long overdue recognition. My father wore a simple gray suit, the old field jacket left carefully at home for the first time I could remember in years. He seemed smaller in that formal setting than I'd ever seen him. Not diminished exactly, but quietly braced, the way you brace yourself walking into a room you've spent decades avoiding. The Sterling family arrived precisely on time, Vivian in a tailored coat, glancing around the modest armory with an expression I recognized immediately, polite tolerance for an event she clearly expected to be brief and unremarkable. We took our seats together, my father between Adam and me, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Let me pause here and ask you something. Has someone quiet in your family ever surprised you with a part of their history you never knew existed, something they carried silently for years without ever once asking for recognition? Tell me about them in the comments. And if this story is already hitting somewhere real, go ahead and subscribe to Storyhouse now, because the ceremony hasn't even started yet. The ceremony begins. The program opened with a color guard presentation and a brief address from a regional commander about the importance of honoring service members whose contributions had gone formally unrecognized for decades due to lost or delayed paperwork, administrative gaps, and, in some cases, veterans themselves choosing not to pursue the recognition they'd earned. I watched my father's jaw tighten slightly at that last line, and I understood, in that moment, that he was hearing his own quiet decision described from a podium in front of strangers. Several names were called before his. Each recipient walked forward to modest, respectful applause, received their formal citation, and returned to their seat. It was solemn, dignified, and, I noticed, entirely unremarkable to Vivian, who checked her phone twice during the second recipient's citation. Then a two-star general stepped to the podium, and the room's entire atmosphere shifted. The general. I want to describe this moment as precisely as I can, because I've replayed it in my memory more times than I could count since. The general didn't read from a prepared card the way the previous presenter had. He set his notes down entirely and looked out over the small crowd, his expression unusually personal for a formal military ceremony. Before we continue, he said, I want to acknowledge something outside the standard program today, because it matters to me personally, and I believe it will matter to this room. He looked directly toward our row. 31 years ago, as a young captain, I was part of a unit pinned down under heavy fire during an extraction that should have ended very differently than it did. I am alive today, along with 3 other men in that unit because one soldier, against direct orders, under conditions I still cannot fully describe without difficulty, went back into that position twice to bring us out. The room had gone completely silent. I have spent 3 decades trying to locate that soldier properly, through paperwork gaps and incomplete records that never should have existed. Today, for the first time, I finally have that opportunity. He looked directly at my father. Sergeant, First Class, Gerald Kessler. The salute. My father stood slowly, and the general walked directly off the stage, down the center aisle, past 3 rows of seated officers and dignitaries who instinctively rose as he passed, until he reached my father standing quietly beside our row of folding chairs. The general saluted him first, a full, formal salute, held for several long seconds, before my father, visibly overwhelmed, returned it out of decades-old instinct. It's an honor, Sergeant, the general said, his voice audibly unsteady. A long overdue one. I've carried this debt for 31 years, and I intend to make sure it's finally recorded properly, starting today. I glanced sideways, in that moment, at Vivian Sterling. I want to describe her expression honestly because I've thought about it often since. It wasn't shock exactly, not at first. It was something closer to complete recalibration, an entire decade of quiet assumptions visibly rearranging themselves behind her eyes in real time. The general escorted my father to the stage himself, and what followed was a formal, on-the-record account of a mission I'd never once heard my father describe in any detail, a rescue under sustained enemy fire that had saved 4 men's lives, an action that had been recommended for the Silver Star decades earlier, delayed indefinitely by a records transfer that had simply, quietly, never been completed. The general presented it to him personally, in front of the entire room, his voice breaking slightly as he did. After the ceremony, the reception afterward was a blur of handshakes and careful, respectful conversation. Officers approaching my father directly, addressing him by rank, several of them, I noticed, with genuine emotion in their voices, as they thanked him for his service in ways that clearly went beyond formal courtesy. Vivian approached him during a quiet moment near the refreshment table, and I stayed close enough to hear the exchange. "Gerald," she said, his actual name, I realized, possibly for the first time in 12 years. "I had absolutely no idea. I'm deeply sorry if anything I've ever said made you feel—" She paused, visibly searching for words that didn't come easily to her. "Made you feel smaller than you are." My father was quiet for a moment, the same careful stillness I'd known my entire life. "I never needed you to know, Vivian," he said finally, without any particular edge in his voice. "I made a choice a long time ago to just be Nora's father and a mechanic, and that was always enough for me, regardless of what anyone else thought it should mean." It wasn't a cutting response. It wasn't meant to be. But I watched it land on Vivian with more weight than any sharper comment could have managed. "Before I tell you what changed after that day, I want your honest answer. If you found out someone your family had quietly dismissed for years turned out to have carried something this significant in silence, would it change how you saw every past comment you'd made? Or is that kind of realization something people tend to move past too easily? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed to Storyhouse yet, now's the time, because there's more to this story. What changed and what didn't? I want to give you an honest account of what actually changed after that ceremony, because I think it matters more than a tidy resolution. The Sterling family's treatment of my father shifted, visibly, in the months that followed. Vivian began using his name instead of his label, Charles asked him, for the first time in 12 years, genuine questions about his life, rather than making passing jokes about different corners of the workforce. At the following Christmas, my father was seated, for the first time, at the head of the table rather than near the kitchen door. But I want to be honest about something else too, because I promised honesty at the start of this story. My father didn't seem particularly moved by any of it. He accepted the changed treatment politely, the same quiet way he'd accepted 12 years of being called the mechanic, without ever once needing either version of their regard to validate who he actually was. It would have been nice, he told me once, months later, if they'd simply treated me decently before they had a reason that impressed them. That's the part I notice now, Nora. Not that they finally see me, that they needed a general to tell them to look. I sat with that for a long time. I think it's the truest thing anyone said to me across that entire year. People ask me sometimes what it felt like, watching my father receive that recognition after 12 years of hearing him quietly diminished at his own daughter's family dinners. I tell them the truth. It felt like relief, mostly, and something more complicated underneath it. A kind of grief for every ordinary Thanksgiving where my father simply absorbed a small, careless comment without ever once correcting the room, because he'd decided, decades earlier, that his worth didn't require anyone else's understanding to be real. My father spent 31 years being simply, quietly present, fixing garage doors and lawnmowers, showing up for every dinner, never once trading on a story he could easily have used to command a different kind of respect. It took a general's salute in the end to make a room finally notice what had been sitting quietly among them the entire time. If you've ever underestimated someone in your family for their quiet, unremarkable presence, I hope this story reminds you of something simple. The people who never ask for recognition are so often the ones who've earned the most of it. Thank you for watching. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this, make sure you're subscribed to Storyhouse. There's a lot more where this came from.